A $3 billion agreement between two Chinese companies quietly settled something the memory industry had spent years treating as impossible. A domestic supplier, still carrying the marks of every export restriction that shaped its production floor, committed to a volume and a delivery schedule that one of the world's largest cloud operators signed. The document recording that moment is the Tencent and Changxin Memory Technologies supply agreement, and it has two readings. The first is about what the contract says it accomplished. The second is about the number the contract chose not to explain. Read the price line once, and it looks like an arrival. Read the silence around that price line, and it looks like a decision about how much to ask for and how much to leave alone. The contract's first reading begins with the most basic fact the document records: that Changxin Memory Technologies can commit to a volume and a delivery schedule that a hyperscaler of Tencent's scale is willing to sign. Hyperscalers do not absorb supply risk from unproven fabs. They qualify vendors over months, hold them to strict defect per unit tolerances, and rarely extend multi-year obligations to suppliers who have not already proven they can sustain output at pressure. A signed multi-billion-dollar agreement is itself a qualification document. The contract records that Changxin passed. The reported price adds a second layer to that establishment. At roughly 10% below Samsung's current market rate for comparable memory, the contract does not describe a supplier selling at cost to buy a logo. A 10% discount on a price that has itself risen substantially over the past several years is still a commercially viable margin. The contract, on its face, describes a supplier that has found the floor of what the market will accept without yet testing how far below that floor it could go. The text says, there is a gap. It does not say the gap was chosen because the supplier needed it to close the deal. The contract also establishes a precedent of domestic sourcing for a class of workload that Chinese hyperscalers have historically sourced from Samsung, SK Hynix, or Micron. Cloud inference and general server memory, the categories this agreement covers, represent recurring, predictable demand that Chinese cloud operators have sent offshore for years, not because domestic alternatives were unavailable in small quantities, but because no domestic supplier had demonstrated it could absorb a hyperscaler's full demand profile. The headline value of this contract signals to every other Chinese cloud operator that a qualified domestic option exists. That is the information the broader market needed before it could move. One more thing the contract establishes, through what surrounds it: Apple has been named in analyst commentary as a plausible next buyer. That naming is not in the contract. It appears in market reporting about the contract. The distinction matters to everything that follows. The contract records one buyer. Analysts name a second. That gap between the document and its reception is the first place the second reading begins. The price line, read again, sits inside a silence the contract never fills. The agreement records a roughly 10% discount to Samsung's current rate. It does not record what Samsung's current rate represents relative to Samsung's own pricing 3 years ago. Memory spot prices have moved through a substantial cycle in the years since the pandemic supply glut, and Samsung's current price is not the baseline it once was. A 10% reduction from a price that has already recovered or exceeded prior peaks is a different commercial statement than a 10% reduction from a stable long-term average. The contract does not tell us which world we are in. It states the gap. It does not state the floor from which the gap was measured, and without that floor, the gap cannot be read as either aggressive or conservative. It can only be read as present. The contract does not specify yield rates, and that absence carries weight that the document itself does not acknowledge. Every memory supply agreement between a mature supplier and a hyperscaler carries implicit yield guarantees, defect densities, bin distributions, thermal tolerances, because the buyer's system architects design around known performance envelopes. The absence of any public yield language in reporting around this contract means either those terms are confidential, which is normal, or that the contract's scope permits flexibility that a Samsung agreement would not. The document does not say which. What it also does not say is whether Changxin's production at this volume still depends on lithography equipment that is itself subject to export controls, tooling whose continued availability is not guaranteed by the contract, and whose absence would not appear anywhere in its text. The contract records an obligation. It does not record the supply chain that fulfills it. Think of a new airline entering a route at fares 10% below the incumbent carrier. That airline is not deregulating aviation. It is finding the price point at which passengers switch without triggering a price war the incumbent would win. The question the fare does not answer is whether the new carrier intends to hold that gap or close it once the route is established. The Tencent and Changxin agreement presents exactly that open question, and its text declines to answer it. The contract's most consequential silence may be the customer it does not name. Analyst commentary has floated Apple as a potential next buyer, and that inference has circulated widely enough to shape how this agreement is understood by people who have not read its terms. But the contract records only one buyer. It does not contain a pipeline. It does not record Changxin's qualification status with Apple, which maintains a supplier qualification process substantially more stringent than most hyperscalers, and runs its own yield validation independent of any other customer's assessment. The leap from Tencent to Apple is a leap the document does not make. What the document actually records, read carefully, is that one Chinese buyer committed to one Chinese supplier at a price that preserved margin for both parties. The Apple narrative is in the margin notes, not the text, and reading it back into the contract as though it were latent, there is the close reading error this channel exists to name and prevent. The contract's decisive silence is the one surrounding intent. A 10% discount is large enough to close a deal and small enough to preserve the existing pricing order. If Changxin's objective were to fracture the Samsung and Micron hold on DRAM pricing, the instrument for doing so is not a 10% reduction. It is a 30 or 40% reduction sustained at scale until qualification pipelines shift and incumbent suppliers face a choice between matching price and losing share. The contract does not record that ambition. What it records is a price that fits comfortably inside the existing market's tolerance, which means the contract is less a challenge to established pricing power than an application to join it at the junior level. The document establishes that Changxin has learned what the market will pay. It does not establish that Changxin intends to change what the market pays. The record leaves further gaps the document cannot close from inside itself. The contract, as reported, does not include its full terms, so the price figure and the discount to Samsung carry the uncertainty of any figure drawn from secondary reporting rather than a primary filing. A summary compresses the conditions that make numbers meaningful, and what has reached the public record is a summary. The contract also does not record Changxin's cost of production, which means the margin the price implies is an inference. A 10% discount to Samsung's rate could represent healthy profit at Changxin's cost structure, or it could represent an entry price the contract's text would not reveal either way. The contract does not establish whether its terms are renewable, whether volume commitments scale over time, or whether performance milestones gate payment, all of which would substantially change what a close reading could conclude about Changxin's actual production confidence. And the contract does not record what Samsung or Micron know about it, or whether either has begun adjusting qualification incentives with Chinese hyperscalers in response. The competitive reaction, if there is one, is not in this document. What the record leaves open, taken together, is whether this transaction represents the first step of a sustained repricing of memory supply in the Chinese market, or a single design win that plants a flag without yet holding the ground. Read the Tencent and Changxin contract on its face, and it records a genuine achievement. A Chinese memory supplier closed a hyperscaler deal at a commercially viable price, without the subsidy optics that would have made the win easier to dismiss, and without the desperate undercutting that would have signaled desperation rather than confidence. Read the contract against its silences and it records something more specific. A supplier that has found the price the market accepts and has chosen to take it, not to break it. The restriction that shaped Changxin's development, the tooling embargo, the qualification wall, the years of being locked outside the top tier of the supply chain, is legible in the contract's structure because it produced exactly the kind of supplier the contract describes, one that knows the value of being inside the price band and has learned not to test how far outside it the market will go. The contract does not say China has freed the memory market. It says China has learned what the memory market charges and decided that price was worth paying. The next document worth reading closely is whichever export control amendment first names Changxin by entity rather than by category. Because the day a regulator decides a supplier has crossed from emerging to competitive threat is the day the silence in this contract starts speaking louder than anything it recorded. If that is the kind of reading you want to be here for, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next instrument is already in the record.